Alright, so just before I actually start this video, I just wanted to say that I'm mainly doing this as a type of easier to make video just to bridge the gap until my next actual full video comes out. And I'll probably end up doing this a couple of times going forward just because it allows me to make something to actually voice my opinions while also giving me more time to actually play through and edit the actual game. Because RPGs are usually on the longer side, it's not something I can clear in a few days and get a whole month of editing time on. But enough with the introduction, and let's get started on the first of my minisodes. I don't really want to call it a minisode, it's probably going to be pretty decently length as it is. But enough with the introduction, let's get started on the first of my minisodes, the combat of Final Fantasy XVI. Now, Final Fantasy XVI is a game that I can say a lot on. A game is more than the sum of its parts, and everything from its narrative, music, characters, world building, gameplay, and more all go together to make the final product, and I can talk about all of them. But I'm going to choose to talk about the gameplay because not only is it an important part of the game and the discussion around it, but also because I don't wish to discuss anything that might be considered spoilers, since I still consider the game fairly new. I will obviously mention some very minor stuff like some of the characters from the game, the icons, names of abilities, and some gameplay footage, but everything I have is either from the early game or taken out of context and avoid, with the exception of one major boss fight that I will show very briefly, and I'll put a warning in front with a time skip so you can avoid it if you wish. Now the very first thing I want to state, and this will be the main basis for a lot of my takes on this, is that I do consider the game to be an action RPG. The main reason why I'm saying this is because many people do not consider it an RPG at all, and even the devs call it the first action game in the series, ignoring all the other action games in the process. And as more and more games incorporate RPG mechanics into their gameplay, I know that sometimes games can be debatable here. Like, you most likely wouldn't consider the original God of War games to be RPGs despite having some basic mechanics like different weapons and a leveling system. But then you come to the newer God of War games and we have an entire crafting system with gear and abilities that you can swap out, accessories, buffs, debuffs, and elemental damage, and all of a sudden these lines start to get kind of muddy. Some people will still say that's a pure action game, just with the minor RPG mechanics there to either enhance or ruin it depending on their stance, while others will say it's an action RPG now because, it's got a good chunk of RPG mechanics in there. In the end, everyone will define things differently, genres are kind of just basic guidelines at this point, and for me, I do consider it to be an RPG. And I vastly prefer how Final Fantasy XVI incorporates these RPG mechanics compared to God of War, which sounds kind of weird when you remember that there are significantly less RPG mechanics in the game compared to God of War, but I'll touch on that for a little bit later. And also, fair warning, I will be comparing the game to other games a lot in this. If you don't want that, then I'm sorry. And alright, so first things off the bat, you'll notice that Clive's moveset is very slim. Obviously, you are in the early game, so you will have very few abilities and you'll unlock a few more while going on, like a forward lunge, downward strike, and the like, but you never actually gain anything extreme with your basic moveset. In the early game, it doesn't feel too bad because, other action games have limited movesets in the beginning, but the fact is, you'll unlock most of Clive's basic combat abilities very early in and be left with nothing but the actual icon abilities to upgrade, because Clive lacks any sort of weapon switching or alternate combat styles. At first, that's what I thought the icons would be, different combat styles, with each icon changing Clive to focus on a different aspect, like Garuda is the icon of wind, so I thought that she would give icon like a branch of moves focused on aerial combat. But instead, switching icons simply changes one command, which is your iconic feat, which is mapped to circle. It was a weird choice that I didn't understand at first, but as I progressed, the more I think I began to understood it. And I'm just saying here, I'm thinking. I could be just completely making it up, and this is how I'm choosing to, cope, but this is what I believe the combat system was going for. And what I mean by that is, you see, Clive's default moveset is slim, sure, but there are 8 total icons that you can attune to by the end of the game. So we have 7 different iconic feats. In addition to these, we also have iconic abilities that, when they're fully leveled, can be equipped even when we don't have that icon attuned. Meaning you can have one of Shiva's abilities while being attuned to the Phoenix. So now you can use Diamond Dust while being attuned to the Phoenix and having Phoenix Shift as your iconic feat. The only real downside to this is that since we don't really gain this freedom until the late game or New Game Plus, because, you know, you're obviously unlocking these as you go along, which means you have 35 abilities and 7 feats that you can now combine together in a whole bunch of ways, and that is how I think the game wants you to play. I do not believe that the game is using your default auto attack as your main moveset. I believe that, much like in an RPG, your abilities that you equip the character with are how the game wants you to play. You know, if you're looking at a mage character in an RPG, you know, it's your spells. Your default auto attack is not your main attack that you will use. You'll be using your different spells that you have equipped for most of that moveset. So, you know, for me, that's what I'm doing. You know, I'm looking at an RPG, and while, yeah, in some games, it's possible to have your character do everything, in other games, your character can only do certain things. You know, if you want to learn a spell, you know, you might only be able to hold 3 level 1 spells on that character. So you have to sacrifice another level 1 spell to make room for that next level 1 spell. And then level 1 spells, despite being weaker than level 2 spells, cost less MP or have more casts available so that you can use them more commonly. And if we bring this logic to Final Fantasy XVI, while the game does lack a traditional magic system, it replaced these with cooldowns. Stronger abilities like Giga Flare have longer cooldowns, much like higher level spells have more magic and fewer casts. Both will limit their use, but weaker abilities like Raging Fists cost less magic, or in this case have a shorter cooldown. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, but God of War also has cooldowns and mostly follows that same logic, as does any game with cooldown abilities, so what's your point? And my big point is that in God of War, the cooldowns are essentially just big, stronger attacks for the most part. Maybe dealing with some more elemental damage here and there or helping with crowd control, but they aren't really built to be part of a moveset. Instead, they are intended to be used to boost the already extensive moveset. You know, Kratos has, in God of War Ragnarok, he has 2 main weapons plus his fist, and obviously midway through the game he gets a 3rd weapon, so now he's bouncing back and forth between all these weapons, and they all have their own unique abilities and aspects that aren't on cooldowns. And then the cooldown abilities are just there to deal extra damage, or maybe you want to freeze an enemy in place for a bit or something. But on the other hand, every feat and every ability in Final Fantasy XVI is a unique ability with a set purpose. Ignition is nothing similar to Rising Flames, but which is nothing similar to Titanic Block, which is nothing similar to Wicked Wheel, and so on. And many of those abilities can be traced back to abilities that you would find in an RPG, but now contextualized within Final Fantasy XVI's combat style. Satellite boosts the damage of your magic attacks, similar to the Prayer spell in a classic Final Fantasy. Just instead of actually boosting your magic, it now just attacks alongside you. Satellite just creates 2 little satellites that hover over your shoulders, and every time you press the ranged attack button, it shoots little magic bursts at your enemy. Will of the Wikes is just a barrier spell, similar to Barrier and Mana Ward, just now with the added bonus of dealing damage when you are standing close to it. And if you upgrade it, it now not only takes more hits before damaging, but also damages enemies more often when you stand next to them, much like how you might be able to upgrade a barrier spell in an RPG. Impulse is a damage over time, similar to a poison spell, but it's now reworked into an action game format, so it staggers enemies and can be detonated like a bomb. And I thought about this while making a video, but since it holds enemies in place with that stagger, you could also think of it as a spell like Bind, if you truly wish to. And so that's my logic. The cooldown abilities in Final Fantasy XVI are just that. They are abilities. and they are abilities that you're supposed to use actively. You're supposed to work these abilities in different combos with one another, and you can create some interesting combinations. And to me, that is my logic. Clive might not be able to learn a triple cast multi-hit fire spell like Firaga, but what he can use is Satellite to shoot 3 magic blasts at the same time, lock onto Lightning Rod, and then just go ham shooting it. Every attack would hit every enemy in range of the Lightning Rod multiple times per button press, which is functionally the same thing in my mind. What's the difference between saying I hit triangle and hit 5 enemies 5 times with a magic spell versus I hit triangle and hit this thing 5 times, which then damages all the enemies in the area 5 times. Trying to get what I'm saying? It's to me the same thing. Now, does the game do a perfect job at this? And I'm afraid it really doesn't. While it's cool to have your moveset be constantly customizable and constantly be able to switch out abilities to pick the optimal loadout for a situation, the fact that you're unlocking these abilities as the game progresses, and most of them are pretty easy, you'll probably end up with a combination that works 90% of the time, and you'll just use those for every encounter. And while they do have some stuff that can force you to experiment, like challenge rooms that limit your moveset, or arcade mode, which throws in any of the stages you previously completed and with fixed equipment and just lets you aim for a higher score, it doesn't kind of fix the issue that the majority of situations can be solved by just using the same abilities in the same manner every single time. And it really can cause combat to become very repetitive unless you intentionally go out of your way to change it. And it's especially true on the boss fights, because boss fights have a stagger gauge. And during their stagger state, they get a damage multiplier. So during this, you'll most likely want to use the majority of your abilities during that stagger stage. So if an enemy's almost staggered, you'll probably intentionally cripple yourself to not use your abilities, which just brings you down to using your default moveset, which, as I stated, was pretty limiting. And now you just kind of put yourself in the spot where for several seconds at a time, or maybe for a minute, you're just default attacking, and it kind of sucks, and you don't want to do that. And then once you actually get to the stagger state, now you just sit there and spam all of your abilities, and it's not very creative. The game also has accessories, and I vastly prefer how they are done here compared to many other new games that have RPG mechanics incorporated, because there's something very refreshing about just having an item description say, plus 15 damage to this ability, or minus 10 seconds on this ability's cooldown. Because to me, that's just so much better than saying the whole, like, plus 0.5% damage dealt to burning enemies thing. And especially in Final Fantasy mode, which is this game's equivalent of a harder New Game Plus mode. Not only does Final Fantasy mode have revamped enemy arrangements, but they also have stuff like healers and enemies that can buff other enemies start spawning far sooner. But most importantly to what I'm talking about right now, they have a crafting system that lets you upgrade accessories, which you can't do in the base game. You can upgrade your weapons and you can upgrade your armor, but not your accessories. So while you couldn't do it on your first playthrough and you just end up with like a whole bunch of crafting materials left over, now you can actually increase damage or reduce cooldowns on specific abilities even further. And like I said, when you're trying to say, hey, our combat system wants you to actively use these abilities, well, if you can't customize your moveset too much, it leads to you not wanting to do these. Oh, well, congratulations, now we actually can. And when you combine this along with all of the new stages and all of the new enemy encounters, it kind of gives you the idea that this is how the game was intended to be played. Because like I said, on your first playthrough, you just have so many crafting abilities left over. You have so many situations where it's just like, I'm spamming the same abilities every single time. Being able to actually say, hey, we can give you a crafting system that works now, and hey, enemies will start casting heal and barrier so much earlier in. To me, it makes me feel like New Game Plus is intended to be the play, and while I don't have an issue with that, I do think it's just very weird and sticks out like a sore thumb, because there are plenty of other games that just balance stuff better. It's also a bit weird to see that you can't interact with your party in any way. You can interact with Torgal, the wolf. You can issue some basic commands like a very weak regen ability, a launcher, throwdown. I don't know what to call this. You know, when you take an airborne enemy and you knock them to the ground, and you have a basic attack that just deals minor damage. The cool part is that these effects also change depending on when you time them, like a precision sick on an enemy that you just launched into the air can cause Torgal to hold him in the air for a few seconds. But otherwise, Torgal and the other party members are completely AI controlled, and I don't have an issue with AI party members on their own, but Final Fantasy XVIs are noticeably lacking in some places. They do actually fight and use their own abilities as well, but you can't react to them and they don't react to you at all. It seems like a bit of a weak complaint, but consider that you can't issue the commands or upgrade them or really do anything, and they feel kind of lame. Some of them use magic, and 2 of them are strictly melee fighters, and you know, it's cool to see that they can do stuff like cast barrier or shoot magic from a distance, but you can't interact or react to any of this. It just doesn't feel nice when you look at something like Atreus and God of War, or you know, even if you remove his skill tree where you get to upgrade him, he has abilities that he will use. He will jump off your back to get a few hits in. He will find an enemy that you knock to the ground, and he'll hit them a few times to keep them on the ground. He'll strangle an enemy to hold it in place for you. It's really great, you know, seeing an AI party member react to what you do, while also having an AI party member that can, you know, in combat, hold an enemy in place so that you can react to them. So seeing Final Fantasy XVI lack this feels like a step backwards, and even more so when the enemies actually can do this. You know, enemies have healers, enemies can cast barrier, enemies can cast buffs. So seeing that no one in your team can do this feels lame. Like, I know I brought up earlier how one of your abilities can be used like a bind spell to keep enemies in place. What if someone on your team, who I'm not going to say, but someone on your team has magic? What if they could cast a bind spell on an enemy to keep them, you know, locked in place for help with crowd control? Or what if when you launched an enemy into the air, they froze them in place, allowing you to now jump up and finish off a combo there? Like, to me, I think that would have been really cool and go a long way, but these are far from the worst AI party members. It's just, to me, they're very weak, and they don't stick out in any sort of meaningful way. The one spot that is just like universally loved though is the boss fights. Every boss goes hard. I can't really describe them in too great detail without spoiling anything, but they all have presentation that rises above and beyond, where even the ones that are just mostly quick time events, they feel cool on your first playthrough. And even at their lowest, you know, the first boss in the game, Garuda, she feels great on your first playthrough because you're controlling a big, hulking, mindless monster just consumed by rage, fighting another big, hulking monster. But on Final Fantasy difficulty, they actually spice this up by having Garuda fight back instead of just getting stomped in 3 seconds. So it's very cool to see that as all these boss fights rank up as the game progresses, you know, even at its weakest, when you go back through and you're now on your second playthrough, they spice it up to try and keep it holding that same impact. And I don't know, it's stupid. I love it. You know, small detail. They very easily could have just had it be another 3-second boss fight, but I like it. I still wish that you had more moves during that fight, but I like it. You know, I probably forgot some stuff here and there. I'm mainly just rambling. I'm not trying to be like a professional reviewer and, you know, go in depth with this or anything. I'm just kind of saying like, hey, I want to get a video out this month, so I'm just spitballing stuff. And yeah, I really enjoy the game despite the flaws that it does have. I think its strengths vastly outweigh its flaws, especially within the gameplay. I know that I can talk and crap on a lot of stuff, and I recognize not for everyone either. You know, there might be those who wish for a more strategic combat system like in Final Fantasy VII Remake, which, you know, I can find comparisons to. You know, you look at Cloud, he has a very basic default moveset. You know, he has no aerial combat. He has just the one attack button that he'll attack over and over. But because of how the ATB system works, because of how you have the actual magic system with elemental weaknesses and everything, the combat feels more strategic, and you're also supposed to be flashing back and forth between different characters, so it all works out as opposed towards 7 Remake. So even though I find some similarities here, you know, it's vastly different and more strategic in 7 Remake. There might be those who want a more traditional action combat system like in Devil May Cry or God of War. Because, you know, you control one character, so you want that one character to constantly have a unique moveset. You know, if you look at Dante, he switches between combat styles. You look at Nero in Devil May Cry has the most moves on one specific character. So seeing stuff like this works through, and, you know, even those who want more party members to do stuff, like me, you know, like I'm not a fan of the fact that your combat members are kind of just there. And, you know, there are probably those that perfectly enjoyed it for what it is, and it's all going to come down to what you want. It's not perfect. It's got more than enough to keep me engaged, and this goes double for everything else. You know, the storytelling, the world building, and characters. All of these I find important in RPGs, and I'd probably talk about them at some point. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this video of me kind of just rambling about Final Fantasy 16. Dragon Quest II coming next month, November. Get ready, because I'm going to talk about that game for a lot.